Ambassador Kira Thess adjusted her ceremonial robes for the third time in as many minutes, her slender fingers smoothing the flowing fabric that cascaded from her shoulders like liquid starlight. The Velari delegation had spent months preparing for this moment, the first formal peace talks between her people and the Terran Alliance aboard the neutral station orbiting Corvix Prime. She stood in the observation deck of Harmony Station, watching the blue-white glow of the planet below. Through the reinforced transparisteel, her reflection stared back tall and elegant, with the characteristic silver-tinted skin of her species and the delicate tendrils that framed her face like a crown of living silk. To any observer, she appeared the picture of diplomatic composure. Inside, however, her hearts raced with nervous energy. The door chimed softly behind her, and she turned with practiced grace, expecting to see her aide with the final briefing materials. Instead, she found herself face to face with a human male she didn't recognize. He was taller than she'd expected most. Humans were shorter than the Velari, with dark hair that looked slightly disheveled and eyes the color of Earth's oceans. He wore the deep blue uniform of the Terran Diplomatic Corps, but carried himself with a casual confidence that immediately set her on edge. "Ambassador Thess, I presume?" He smiled, extending his hand in the human gesture of greeting. "Captain Marcus Red, Terran Diplomatic Security. I'll be your liaison during the talks." Kira hesitated for a moment before accepting the handshake, noting how warm his skin felt against hers. "Captain Reed, I was expecting to meet with Ambassador Chun." "Last-minute change of plans," Marcus said, his smile never wavering. "The ambassador caught a Centauri flu bug yesterday. Nothing serious, but the medical team wanted him in quarantine until it passes. I hope you don't mind working with second string." The casual way he dismissed protocol made her tendrils flutter with agitation, or perhaps something else she couldn't quite identify. That is acceptable. Though I must note this deviation from our agreed-upon arrangements." "Duly noted," he said with a slight bow that managed to be both respectful and somehow playful. "I promise I won't let my inferior rank compromise the dignity of these proceedings." Was he joking? Kira found herself studying his expression, trying to decipher the subtle indicators of human emotion. Among the Velari, such informality during first contact would be considered deeply inappropriate, yet something about his manner suggested no disrespect was intended. "Shall we proceed to the briefing room?" she asked, falling back on formal protocol. "Lead the way, Ambassador. Though I have to say," he added as they walked toward the corridor, "those ceremonial robes are impressive. The way the fabric catches the light, it's like wearing captured starlight." Kira's cheeks warmed, a flush of deep violet spreading across her features. Compliments on appearance were unexpected in diplomatic contexts. She kept her eyes forward, hoping her reaction wasn't as obvious as it felt. "The robes are traditional," she managed, her voice perhaps a touch breathier than intended. "Worn by Velari diplomats for over 3 centuries. "Well, tradition serves you well," Marcus said easily, seemingly oblivious to the effect his words had on her. As they entered the briefing room, Kira caught her reflection in the polished metal walls. Her violet blush was indeed visible, a telltale sign of emotional response that any Velari would immediately recognize. She could only hope that humans were less observant about such things. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was already hoping this particular human wouldn't notice her reactions, while simultaneously hoping he would continue to provoke them. This was going to be a very interesting diplomatic mission. 3 days into the negotiations, Kira found herself looking forward to Marcus's morning briefings with an anticipation that had nothing to do with diplomatic protocol. He had an uncanny ability to make even the most tedious procedural reviews feel engaging, often punctuating serious discussions with observations that made her tendrils curl with suppressed amusement. The Centauri delegation is still insisting on Clause 47, Marcus said, sliding a steaming cup across the conference table toward her. I brought you something from the Earth Cultural Exchange Program. It's called Coffee Thought. You might like to try it. Kira accepted the cup cautiously, inhaling the rich, complex aroma. The gesture was so casual, so thoughtful, that her cheeks began their telltale shift toward violet before she could control the reaction. This is ... kind of you. Though I should mention that Velari have different metabolic requirements already. Checked with Dr. Hartwell in xenobiology, Marcus interrupted with a grin. She assured me it's perfectly safe for your species. Might even have a mild stimulant effect, which could be useful given how late these sessions are running. The fact that he'd taken the time to research Velari physiology, just to share a simple beverage with her, sent an unexpected warmth spreading through her chest. She took a tentative sip, surprised by the bittersweet complexity of flavors. It's pleasant, she said, and found herself adding more honestly. Actually, it's quite remarkable. The depth of flavor is unlike anything in Velari cuisine. Earth has thousands of varieties, Marcus said, settling into the chair beside her, rather than across the table, as protocol would dictate. If you like this one, I've got samples from at least a dozen different regions. Consider it cultural. Exchange. Over the following hour, as they reviewed negotiation points and prepared for the day's sessions, Kira found herself stealing glances at her human companion. He had a way of gesturing with his hands when he spoke that was entirely alien to Velari communication, yet somehow expressive and engaging. When he laughed, which he did, often his whole face transformed, and she felt an odd flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the caffeine. Tell me something, Marcus said during a lull in their discussions. Those tendrils of yours, they move when you're thinking, don't they? I've noticed they curl differently when you're considering something complex versus when you're just listening. Kira's tendrils immediately stilled, a reflexive response to being observed so closely. Among her people, such attention to micro-expressions was considered either rude or intimate, depending on the relationship between the individuals involved. You're very observant, she said carefully. Occupational hazard, Marcus replied. Plus, I find Velari expressions fascinating. Your people communicate so much through subtle cues that humans miss entirely. Like right now your cheeks are doing that violet thing again. What does that mean, exactly? The direct question caught her completely off guard. Her flush deepened to a rich purple as she realized he'd been aware of her reactions all along. It's a sign of emotional response. Similar to human blushing, I suppose. Emotional response to what? His voice was gentle, curious rather than probing. Kira found herself trapped between diplomatic training and an unfamiliar desire for honesty. To ... unexpected kindness. To feeling welcomed when I expected mere tolerance. Something shifted in Marcus's expression, a softening around his eyes that made her heart skip. Kira, he said, using her given name for the first time, you're not just being tolerated here, at least not by me. A moment stretched between them, charged with implications neither quite dared to voice. Finally, Marcus's communication device chimed, breaking the spell. The Centauri delegation is ready to reconvene, he said, though his eyes remained on her face. As they gathered their materials and prepared to face another day of complex negotiations. Kira realized that somewhere between the coffee and the careful observations, she'd begun to think of this human not as a diplomatic necessity, but as something far more dangerous to her composure, a friend, and possibly something even more complicated than that. The breakthrough came during the 5th day of negotiations, though not in the way anyone expected. The Centauri had walked out after a particularly heated exchange about mining rights, leaving the human and Velari delegations to salvage what they could of the tri-party accord, Kira found herself working alongside Marcus well into the station's night cycle, their heads bent over data tablets in the empty conference room. The artificial lighting had dimmed to evening settings, casting everything in warm, golden hues that made the space feel unexpectedly intimate. "If we can restructure the resource allocation matrix," she murmured, her stylus tracing calculations. "Across the tablet's surface, we might be able to present the Centauri with terms they can't refuse." Marcus leaned closer to see her work, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "That's brilliant," he said softly. "You've essentially made it more profitable for them to cooperate than to maintain their current isolationist stance." His proximity was doing things to her concentration that she hadn't anticipated. Her tendrils had begun their subtle dance again, and she could feel the familiar warmth building in her cheeks. What alarmed her more was how much she didn't want him to move away. "I've been wondering," Marcus said, his voice taking on that careful tone she'd learned to recognize as prelude to a personal question. "What would happen if I touched your tendrils? I don't want to cause offense or discomfort, but I'm curious about Vaylari's sensory experience." The question sent a shock of sensation through her entire nervous system. Among her people, tendril contact was reserved for family members and intimate partners. The very suggestion made her breath catch. "That would be highly personal," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Too personal?" he asked, immediately beginning to pull back. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Not too personal," she interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. "Just ... very personal. Tendrils are sensitive. Touch that would be felt quite intensely." Marcus went very still. "Intensely how?" Instead of answering with words, Kira found herself turning to face him fully. Their knees brushed under the table, and she didn't pull away. "Would you like to find out?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond cultural curiosity. Marcus searched her face, and she knew he could see the deep violet of her cheeks, the slight tremor in her tendrils, the way her breathing had become shallow and quick. "Are you sure?" he asked. Rather than answer, she reached up and guided his hand toward her face. The moment his fingertips brushed against the base of her tendrils, she gasped. The sensation was unlike anything in human experience. Not quite touch, not quite electricity, but something that sent waves of pleasure cascading through her nervous system. Marcus's eyes widened as he felt the silky texture, noting how her tendrils seemed to respond to his touch by curling gently around his fingers. "They're so soft," he breathed, "and warm. Does this feel good?" "Yes," she whispered, her eyes fluttering closed as he continued his gentle exploration. "Very good." When she opened her eyes again, Marcus was looking at her with an intensity that made her heart race. The careful professional distance they'd maintained was crumbling, replaced by something raw and honest and entirely inappropriate for a diplomatic mission. "Kira," he said, her name rough in his throat. "I know," she replied, understanding the unspoken question. "This complicates everything." "Everything," he agreed, but his hand didn't leave her tendrils. They stayed like that for a long moment, connected by touch and mutual recognition of the line they were approaching. When Marcus finally, reluctantly, drew his hand away, Kira felt the loss like a physical ache. "We should probably get back to work," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Yes," she agreed, making no move to pick up her tablet, "though I'm finding it rather difficult to concentrate on resource allocation. Matrices at the moment." Marcus laughed, a sound both strained and delighted. "You're not making this easy for me, Ambassador." "I wasn't aware I was supposed to," she replied, allowing herself a small smile that she hoped conveyed exactly how much trouble she was willing to cause Dot as they turned back to their work, both pretending they could focus on anything other than the electricity still crackling between them. Kira realized that whatever was happening between them had moved far beyond cultural exchange or diplomatic cooperation. She was falling for a human, and he seemed to be falling right back. The crisis came on the 7th day, when the Centauri delegation returned with demands that would have gutted the entire peace accord. 12 hours of non-stop negotiations left everyone exhausted and frustrated, with tempers running high and compromise seeming impossible. Kira had never felt so drained. The careful diplomatic composure she'd maintained throughout her career was cracking under the pressure of not just the talks, but the constant awareness of Marcus's presence beside her. Every shared glance, every moment their hands accidentally brushed while reaching for documents, every time he defended her positions to the other delegations, it all contributed to a growing tension that had nothing to do with interstellar politics. As the last of the delegates filed out of the conference room, leaving only scattered data tablets and empty coffee cups as evidence of the day's struggles, Kira found herself alone with Marcus once again. "That was brutal," he said, rubbing his temples with obvious fatigue. "An understatement," Kira replied, gathering her materials with movements that felt mechanical and distant. Her tendrils hung limp with exhaustion, and she knew her usual composure had long since abandoned her. "Kira," Marcus's voice was soft, concerned. "Are you all right?" She paused in her organizing, suddenly aware of how close he was standing, how his presence seemed to ground her even when everything else felt chaotic. "I'm tired and frustrated, and if I'm being honest, I'm finding it increasingly difficult to maintain professional objectivity where you're concerned." The admission hung between them like a challenge. Marcus stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes. "What if we stop trying?" he asked quietly. "Stop trying to what?" "To maintain professional objectivity." Kira's breath caught. Marcus ... "My quarters aren't far," he said, the words both invitation and question. "We could review today's proceedings privately." She knew what he was really asking, just as she knew what her answer would be before the words formed. Yes, the walk to his quarters felt both endless and far too short. The corridors of Harmony Station seemed unusually empty, as if the universe itself was granting them privacy for what was about to unfold. When the door closed behind them with a soft pneumatic hiss, the sound seemed to seal away not just the outside world, but all the careful barriers they'd constructed between them. Marcus's quarters were larger than hers, furnished in the utilitarian style common to diplomatic missions, but softened by personal touches. A plant from Earth, growing in a hydroponic pod, images of what she assumed were family members, books in actual paper form rather than digital tablets. "Would you like something to drink?" he asked, though his voice suggested refreshments were the last thing on his mind. "No," she said, turning to face him fully. "I would like you to touch my tendrils again." The directness of her request seemed to surprise them both. Marcus's eyes darkened as he moved toward her, his hands coming up to frame her face with careful reverence. "Like this?" he murmured, his fingertips barely brushing the sensitive appendages. "Yes," she breathed, her eyes closing as sensation washed through her. "Exactly like that." This time, Marcus didn't hold back. His touch became more confident, more exploring, as he learned what made her gasp and what made her tendrils curl around his fingers in pleasure. When she opened her eyes, she found him watching her with fascination and undisguised desire. "You're so beautiful when you react like that," he said, his voice husky. "Your whole body responds." "It's because tendrils are connected to our entire nervous system," she managed, though coherent explanation was becoming difficult. "Touch their effects ... everything." "Everything?" His touch became more deliberate, and she couldn't suppress the soft moan that escaped her lips. "Marcus," she whispered, her hands finding their way to his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart through the fabric of his uniform. I need you to know that for my people, this level of intimacy, ... It's not casual. It's not casual for me either, he replied, his forehead resting against hers. Kira, I've been thinking about you, dreaming about you for days. I know this complicates everything, but I can't pretend anymore that I don't want this. That I don't want you. Instead of answering with words, she kissed him. The contact was electric, different from human-to-human intimacy, in ways that made them both gasp with surprise and pleasure. Her tendrils wrapped around his neck, creating additional points of connection that amplified every sensation. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Marcus rested his hands on her waist and looked into her eyes with something that went beyond desire, something that looked remarkably like wonder. Stay with me tonight? He asked. Yes, she whispered, and let him lead her toward whatever came next, protocols and diplomatic consequences forgotten in favor of this moment, this connection, this unexpected gift of intimacy between species, who were supposed to be impossibly different. As his hands began to work at the fastenings of her ceremonial robes, Kira realized that she had never felt more herself, more complete, than she did in the arms of this human who saw her not as an ambassador or a representative of her species, but simply as a woman worthy of desire and tenderness. Kira woke to the unfamiliar sensation of warm skin against her own, and the steady rhythm of a heartbeat that wasn't hers. For a moment, disorientation clouded her thoughts. Then memory returned in a rush of warmth and wonder. Marcus's arm was draped across her waist, his breathing deep and even with sleep, his face peaceful in the soft glow of the station's artificial dawn cycle. She allowed herself a few precious minutes to simply observe him, to memorize the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the slight smile that curved his lips even in sleep. Her tendrils, which had remained intimately entwined with his fingers throughout the night, gave a gentle pulse of contentment. The movement woke him, and his blue eyes opened to meet hers immediately, as if some part of him had been waiting for her to wake. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice rough with sleep and something deeper satisfaction, perhaps, or simple happiness. "Good morning," she replied, acutely aware of how different this felt from any awakening in her previous experience. Among the Velari, intimacy was formal, ritualized, bound by centuries of tradition. This casual closeness, this easy comfort in shared space, was entirely foreign and entirely wonderful. "Any regrets?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "None," she said, then added with characteristic honesty, "though I suspect the day ahead may prove complicated." As if summoned by her words, Marcus's communication device chirped with an incoming message. He reached for it reluctantly, his arm tightening around her waist as if to forestall the return of the outside world. "Mandatory staff meeting in 1 hour," he read aloud with a sigh. "The Centauri have apparently had an overnight change of heart about yesterday's proposals." Kira felt the familiar flutter of professional anxiety, but it was tempered now by something new, a sense of partnership that went beyond their diplomatic roles. Then we should prepare. They rose and dressed with a coordination that felt both natural and charged with unspoken understanding. Marcus helped her with the complex fastenings of her ceremonial robes, his fingers lingering at each closure in a way that made her skin tingle with remembered pleasure. "Kira," he said as she prepared to leave for her own quarters to complete her morning preparations, "I want you to know that whatever happens in the negotiations, whatever political complications arise from this, I don't consider last night a mistake." She turned to face him fully, noting the slight uncertainty in his expression, as if he feared she might retreat into diplomatic formality now that day had returned. "Nor do I," she said firmly, "though I think we must discuss how to proceed. Relationships between diplomatic personnel are not forbidden, but they are Dot scrutinized. "Are you worried about your career?" he asked. Kira considered the question seriously. Her position as ambassador was the culmination of decades of work, the highest honor her government could bestow. Yesterday, the thought of compromising it would have been unthinkable. "I'm more worried about losing this," she said, gesturing between them. "Whatever this is becoming." Marcus stepped closer, his hands finding hers with unerring accuracy. "Then we don't lose it. We figure out how to make it work within the bounds of our responsibilities. Other diplomatic couples have managed it. Other diplomatic couples weren't. From different species," she pointed out, though her tone held amusement rather than concern. "True," he conceded with a grin. "But then, I've always enjoyed a challenge." The staff meeting proceeded with surprising smoothness. The Centauri delegation, apparently influenced by overnight communications from their homeworld, had indeed softened their stance on several key issues. Kira found herself working in perfect synchronization with Marcus, their thoughts seeming to align without spoken consultation, their respective negotiation styles complementing each other in ways that impressed even the senior staff. If anyone noticed the subtle changes in their interaction, the way Marcus's hand briefly touched her shoulder when passing behind her chair, or how Kira's tendrils seemed to curl with particular contentment whenever he spoke, they kept their observations to themselves. As the day wore on and genuine progress emerged from what had seemed like impossible negotiations, Kira realized that far from compromising their professional effectiveness, their personal connection had somehow enhanced it. They anticipated each other's moves, supported each other's positions, and presented a united front that proved remarkably persuasive to the other delegations. During a brief recess, Marcus caught her eye across the room and smiled. Not the professional courtesy they'd exchanged for the past week, but something warm and private and full of promise. Later that evening, as they celebrated the successful conclusion of the preliminary agreements with the rest of the diplomatic staff, Kira found herself looking forward not just to the personal time they would share, but to the professional challenges they would face together. She had found something she hadn't known she was looking for, a true partner in every sense of the word. When Marcus appeared at her side with 2 glasses of champagne and a look that suggested he had plans for the remainder of the evening, she accepted both the drink and the unspoken invitation with a smile that made her tendrils shimmer with anticipation. "To successful negotiations," he said, raising his glass. "To new horizons," she replied, and meant it in every possible way.